Hi, Diefesters. My name is Rudolph Vincent, and I am the founder of Diefest Global. A warm welcome to you all on the third edition. This year, Diefest will focus on the future of work by addressing authenticity, belongingness, and social impact as some of the most important practices for building a more inclusive and purpose driven workplace for everyone to thrive. Before we begin, I would like to humbly thank our belonging partner, Newsilla, for supporting our initiative in democratizing world class content and promoting equity in education. On this note, I would like to welcome you to our session on driving equity in education to build the next generation of global leaders. Our moderator for today is the co founder and chief academic officer at Newsilla. He leads the delivery of learning insights that power improvements in student outcomes by Newsella's products and services. He was previously the founding director of digital learning at Achievement First Public Charter Schools, where he spearheads the learning at Achievement, where he spearheads the integration of digital learning technologies across 22 schools, including flipped classrooms, mobile learning, and one-on-one computing. He began his education career in Teach for America and went on to teach in public and private schools as well as in the US Navy. He holds degrees from Wesleyan, Brown, and Tufts University. Please welcome Dan Cogan-Drew.
Thank you so much, Rudy. And it's a pleasure to be here. And Dr. Jenkins, it's wonderful to see you. And thank you for joining us. I was introduced briefly, but let me introduce you. You've been dedicated to serving the needs of students for over 30 years. You were named superintendent for Orange County Public Schools in Florida in 2012. And you've spent the last decade leading one of the largest school systems in the United States with many great successes. You've received many recognitions as a notable leader nationally and been named Florida Superintendent of the Year by multiple entities and been a finalist for the national title. You're quite engaged in the community and served on several notable boards. So in the interest of getting to the conversation, I won't list all of your awards, but we're really privileged to have you in the conversation. And so I'd love to, the topic today is equity, and I'd love to dive in by connecting it briefly to some of our work at Newsella, and then I'd love to ask you how you connected when you're speaking as a leader to your team. So for us, equity is part of, we often say DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we tie equity to our mission, which is meaningful classroom learning for every student. And equity ties notably to the every student portion of our mission. And I wonder, as you think about equity as a topic, as a leader, and as you're leading your teams, what other words do you associate it with? And how do you want your teams to think about equity in their work?
That's a good question, Dan. First, let me thank you for having me on as a speaker for the panel today. I think it's a critical topic. When we consider diversity and equity, inclusion, belonging in the K-12 sector, it's pretty similar to what you have described. And I think the way most parents and most adults would probably easiest relate to it is this notion that every child, when they come into school, feel welcome and respected. There has to be some notion of safety when they enter the school realm, regardless of their background. And I would go one step further. The notion of equity also implies that we are going to do something to level the playing field so that those who are disadvantaged have an equal opportunity to learn and grow and thrive.
And so that sort of leads to a follow-up question then, is that this, speaking about disadvantages and ensuring that there's equitable opportunity for every student. What are some of the obstacles that schools face in ensuring equitable access and equitable outcomes? What stands in the way, and how do you think of the school's role in removing those obstacles?
I think the clearest obstacle has to do with poverty. We just have to speak to the elephant in the room. when we have children who come to school with far fewer advantages at home, in fact, significant disadvantages at home, that is a huge impact on their ability to learn and to grow and to excel in school. And something has to be done to help give them an opportunity to learn. If anyone pretends that there are no differences based on socioeconomic background, they are just not being forthright. And quite frankly, it's just dishonest to imply that there are not significant differences impacted by poverty.
So it's really a central concern, and a school can't necessarily address the financial standing of a family, but there's an obligation as a public entity to work with every child from all homes and all socioeconomic statuses. In the current environment, I'd love to just sort of get right to it. Like a lot of us who are based in the United States, who have been following news and knowing that we're in an election year and approaching an election just next month, we know that there are concerns that districts are addressing when their families that they serve are sending their children to school. And I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about the role that you see a district and district leadership playing in sort of helping families accept the agreements that they enter into when they send their children to public school, and where the lines are between what it means when the child leaves their home. What is the sphere of influence that the parent has at home, and how does that intersect with the responsibilities of the school, and how does that play out? In an election year, it's playing out in many ways that we could get into, but maybe at a high level, how do you think about that agreement that you're asking families to enter into?
So I think schools really are essentially asking parents to be partners, to help their child achieve an educational career that is going to prepare them for life, for a future, for career, for living in this world as a responsible citizen. And so there has to be a partnership with parents. And somehow we've gotten to this level of distrust or accusation almost around how noble those intentions are. So public education design, in my belief, and I believe in most people's belief, is really trying to develop young people into responsible citizens. And so it's not for brainwashing or indoctrination. It's really about teaching them to think for themselves, to be critical thinkers, and to certainly have all of the skills necessary to be a functioning adult. And then, of course, when they leave 12th grade, we want them to leave us ready for a career and a life that is certainly going to be pleasing in their needs as well as in those needs of society. So I think where we cross hairs lately is this notion that parents need to have more say in the curriculum. The truth is the curriculum, the standards are set at the state level, and then schools need to be very specific on how they implement those standards. And so I think it's every parent's right to say, I'd like to see what's being taught. It's posted on most websites. Here are the standards, what every child ought to know and be able to do in this particular grade level. Parents can also say, I would love to come and visit from time to time, as long as it's arranged and there are agreements with teacher unions. That is certainly agreeable as well. Where we tip the scale sometimes, Dan, and get a little bit out of kilter is this notion that there has to be a daily monitoring or a pre-monitoring even of every lesson plan. We've heard notions along those lines. That's probably going a bit too far. There has to be a reasonable partnership and awareness of the standards and some trust that the school is going to teach those standards as the state has set in place. Where we got offline there, it's hard to say, but we've sort of tracked along this notion of perhaps teachers can't be trusted, or there might be brainwashing going on, and that is just not the case.
And the concerns that are arising in board meetings, or that families are bringing forward, this request to inspect plans, this request to have a greater transparency. Where's that coming from? As you mentioned the word trust, do you think that that's the dynamic in trust has changed between families and their schools recently? And what would you attribute it to, if so, or what other explanation do you think?
I suspect a lot of it comes from the realm of social media and the spreading of rumors and quite often myths that simply have no relevance or reality. If parents are encouraged to be fearful, and I have no other way of describing it. Sometimes it feels like fear mongering. Be careful. This is going to happen. That is going to happen. Most parents, research in the past has shown that most parents are pretty pleased with their local school. But when they hear this ranting around public education, they think everyone else's school may be brainwashing children. And so I think social media has played into it. I think political dialogue has played into it, sometimes intentionally, and perhaps sometimes they believe it's actually authentic, some of those allegations, but it's misleading, and parents, I think, sometimes react out of fear, and I can understand that.
And how does that affect the work and the mission of the district as it's trying to serve every student and the mission of equity that we started with? What's the impact of this kind of climate and this sort of, if there is in fact an erosion of trust, how does that impact a classroom?
See, I think I want to stick with the fear factor because I don't want to say specifically it's an erosion of trust, but this notion that people are fearful because of what they're hearing. I think it has a couple of different impacts, Dan. Number one, it creates a harshness towards diversity that already exists within our schools. And so if I have young people who have gender decisions that they are struggling with or dealing with, and the adults are not sensitive to those children, we already know that my LGBTQ community, those youngsters are at high risk of having additional emotional needs and risk and concerns regarding their health. And so all I want is for each child when they come to school, no matter what their gender identity is or any other ethnic or racial identification, I want them to feel safe when they come to school, that they will be respected, that they will be protected, and that they can expect that they will be regarded in the curriculum and in the literature that they read. I agree that parents have a right to say, I don't want my children exposed to certain books, but in some instances, they can't say, I don't want anybody in the school to be exposed to certain books where Johnny and Susie have two moms, for example, because those children are in our schools. And so a parent can say, I don't want my child checking out this kind of book. I don't want this kind of material for my child, but they can't say nobody in the school can have exposure to the book about those children having two mommies because the children exist in our schools. And so I think there has to be a balance somehow, Dan, between parents' preferences for their individual children and partnering with the school on what they can actually check out of the library or be exposed to without going to the extreme of needing to ban anything that does not represent a particular child and his or her family, as opposed to John and Tammy who have two mommies. Let's not at least make it something that's not available to other children in the school. There has to be a balance. And then public education is one choice. Folks may certainly choose other means of educating their children, anything from private school to parochial school to homeschooling, if they want greater levels of control. But in the public sector, there has to be a balance so that all children feel represented and feel protected and safe in that school setting.
Yeah, it certainly raises the question and the dynamic here of a sort of zero-sum game of if there isn't a way, why can't there be a way for everyone to feel a sense of belonging and for us to reach every child equitably, and that there isn't a sense that if one child feels a sense of belonging, another doesn't, and that there's equity for some, but somehow if we skew towards one, we're losing others along the way. And I'm not quite sure where that notion has been introduced, but it certainly seems to be pervasive that there's a sensitivity that if this is going to be discussed, I can't have my child hearing it, and I can't have any child hearing it. And I guess one of the concerns, as you mentioned, that the parents have a right, they can send their children, if they have the means, they can send their children to other institutions where they can be educated. In a world where everyone makes that decision, I worry about the erosion of public education and the impact that that has on the larger goals towards powering and supporting a democratic society. I wonder what your reflections are on that. I mean, how do we move away from the zero-sum game mentality, while acknowledging that every parent wants this for their child, and that such a thing is possible? We can have classrooms where every child feels a sense of belonging and equity.
So I think we learned a few things during the pandemic, actually, Dan. I'm glad you raised that issue. And first, let me also clarify, I am not advocating for any kind of instruction around gender identity. I think every school should stick to their state standards, which do not have a provision for such explicit instruction. That would never be my concern. I think teachers need to be mindful, but I do think curriculum and materials can, in some instances, reflect the diversity of the students that we serve, and then parents can certainly make choices when they want and don't want their children to have exposure to particular items such as library books. I think we learned something from the pandemic, however, when every parent had to go through being a home instructor. By and large, vast numbers returned to public education as soon as it was available, because home instruction is not easy. You ask any parent who actually does homeschooling, it is very challenging work. And the older the children get, the more diverse the curriculum and the more challenging that work would be for any parent. And so I think public education, 90%, the vast majority, I would say 2/3 across this nation are in the public K-12 sector, because that is where most children have their needs served. If you narrow the focus of where your child receives their educational needs, you also narrow some of those extracurricular opportunities as well. So the vast majority of the public will depend on a public K-12 system to serve the needs of their children. In Florida and in other states as well, parents can make a choice with vouchers and go to a private or parochial school, or to do a certain level of homeschooling. And I respect every parent's right to make that choice. I think public education has to compete and has to market what they have to offer in comparison to other entities, and keep their customers coming back because they offer what their children need.
Mm-hmm. I want to acknowledge we have an audience, and I would love to field questions or comments that you have as you're listening in on this conversation, whether you're joining from the United States or abroad, whether these issues are familiar to you because you understand politics of Florida, politics happening in the United States because of being an election year, or whether you're joining us from overseas and some of this may be new, or you want to localize this to your own context. Curious to know how the implications of this kind of debate and conversation that the United States is clearly wrestling with play out in your home situation. So thinking about your role as a leader, and thinking about the themes of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We've been talking about areas where these can be sensitive, where this can be a difficult topic. Can you talk to us a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging as a strength, and as a place to build from, and not always to be, let's say, sometimes we can feel defensive, we can feel like we have to justify, but how does it fuel advances in the work of your schools and in your life as an educator?
I can think of a perfect example, Dan, where what was once thought of as a deficit is now celebrated and lauded as an opportunity. When we had children who did not have English as their original language, they were English language learners. It used to be probably considered a deficit, got to get them proficient in English as quickly as possible. And now it is lauded, bilingualism is lauded and celebrated in districts where you can get a bilingual graduation diploma because you are fluent in both languages, or in more than two languages, actually. And outside of the U.S. and other countries, that is the norm, that young people have more than one language that they are fluent and literate in. And so our ELL population, who have had a history of struggling to achieve in schools in the U.S., now have an advantage of being bilingual, and the notion of dual language is actually celebrated rather than considered a deficit. And I think it's Again, some of this is based on politics in our country that sort of went off the rails around this notion of equity and helping those who are marginalized to have an equal chance, to have a chance at the promise of the American dream. And so in years past, nobody would have thought twice about equity initiatives to level the playing field. Johnny and Susan are both trying to reach an item on the shelf. Johnny needs a step ladder. Susie needs to tiptoe. But Barbara may actually need an actual extension ladder because her height is of such, if she's going to reach that same level, she needs some additional support. And so the American way supports this notion of helping everyone be able to achieve their dreams and to be successful. And somehow there's been a bit of a backlash around the word equity and whether or not there ought to be additional opportunities or supports provided for those who are disadvantaged. And I would submit to anyone, for the children who come from homes in poverty, it is not their fault. They didn't ask to be born in the particular household. And I think it is part of our democracy to offer them support and assistance to help them be successful. The term equity should not be frowned upon as it has been of late for some reason. It's the American way of helping those who don't have their own opportunities, giving them some assistance so that they can achieve success in the American dream.
That's right. And to belong, ultimately feel that they belong in our society, belong in our classrooms. I think that's something that we often frame belonging in a sense as a sort of a static state, something that is persistent, and when in fact it's really dynamic. That is, the same person can belong and feel a sense of belonging in one setting in their home. They can travel to school and suddenly feel that sense of belonging disappear in the first period, and then in the second period feel it resurge as they have a strong bond with their classmates, with their teacher, and then have it immediately disappear once again in the third. And it's a very distracting, to say the least, for a student to feel that sense of belonging ebbing and flowing as we might in the workplace when we show up into a meeting where we're not really sure why we were invited, but we know we have to be there. And we wonder constantly whether this is the right meeting for us, what's our responsibility. It's very hard to focus on the content of the meeting. It's very hard to focus on the content of the lesson if we're concerned, as we might be, about whether this is, are we in the right room? This doesn't seem to be pertinent to us. And I think that's something that is more a human quality than it is particular to schools. Though schools certainly experience this in some magnitude.
And you know what, Dan, our young people can be such a wonderful lesson to the adults, because I think my youth get it. They are more apt to be accepting and celebratory around diversity that is around them. A little bit of nudging on their part, and it is not hard for them to be accepting and encouraging of one another. I can give you example after example where some of my students, two of my students with Down syndrome, ESE special education students, their entire student body got behind them and insisted that they be homecoming king and queen. Other instances, I have gay straight alliance clubs in all of my high schools where children from the LGBTQ community are receiving additional support from students who are straight. They get it, and they are usually very accommodating and very caring about each other. When we have board meetings periodically, when folks show up with different opinions, they are the adults who have very strong opinions about who should be accepted and what should be accepted and acknowledged in the school setting. But I think our young people, I'm encouraged for the future of this country because I see young people that get it, that are very dedicated to diversity and inclusion and equity.
Well, and your comments there resonate with a question that we received from a listener named Dessa, who, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asking whether children's feelings about DEIB have shifted with the misinformation alongside parents, or if they're more open-minded. I guess stepping back, like, have you seen students' attitudes change in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, or a more pronounced outreach or overt attempts, like you were talking about, public public outreach, gestures about being homecoming king and queen. Are they reacting in more noticeable ways?
I see my students being more accepting. I am not concerned about student behavior around these issues at all. One or two outliers might take place from time to time, but by and large, I think our children are very accepting of diversity and inclusion because it's what they've grown up with. When we see adults, quite often, and sometimes, Dan, I'll be honest with you, they may just have particular political opinions. And so they come and make their voices heard. And sometimes they may not actually have children that are in the school system, but they have this deep concern. And sometimes I think it goes back to fear mongering that they need to come and speak out because they're afraid there may be some kind of brainwashing going on. There was one term someone used that was I thought was totally inappropriate, that they were schools are turning little boys into little girls. That is going to gender fear. That stirs up fear and hard feelings and strife. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. But when someone stirred it with that kind of fear and they feel the need to come and speak out about it, you can understand it. It generates from misinformation and from fear. I don't see that happening with our young people. It's with our adults from time to time that we think that misinformation gets out there.
Yeah, and there is a certain distance that some adults have from the life of school if they're not educators themselves. It's been some time since they were in the system. They may not even have children themselves in the school system, and so they're speaking about things at a level of abstraction, which, in our experience, and it may be true for you as well, is that when we get specific about what this actually looks like, let's take a look at the standard, or let's take a look at what students are being asked to read, and we get specific. The objections tend to sort of thin out and dissipate because they are sort of ginned up a little bit more in the abstract than in the concrete.
Absolutely. And when we say, let us step outside with you and show you what our standards are, if you're aware of something different taking place, certainly let us know. But here is what we instruct and here's what's required. And we give them that reassurance. Most times they are reasonable. And I want to be very clear too, Dan. I don't mind that a grandparent or a senior citizen wants to speak up about what's being taught in our schools. I think they should be concerned in general about our young people and about the citizenry. I would love for them to come and volunteer and be a part of the school. They are absolutely welcome. If they have misinformation, we'd like to at least be given an opportunity to correct it, but everyone is welcome to help. There's enough work for everyone to help educate our children. The issue is around how authentic your information is that you bring to that volunteering or to the podium to speak about. We just have to be upfront about that.
Yep. When we were preparing for this conversation, we had a couple of exchanges around something that I was thinking of as referencing a curriculum from an organization called Facing History, which is came out of response to the Holocaust during World War II, and coins an expression that they refer to as the universe of obligation, which is that essentially, as I think of it, is the sort of how far does your circle extend outward from you, the concentric circles of you and society, you and your family, your extended family, onto your community, down your block, and to the larger town or city, even to the country. And even in a sort of basic level, if you're walking past someone on the street and they trip and fall, will you help them up? And at what point do people stop recognizing that you should just help someone up when they fall, because it isn't universal? And I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about, as a leader of one of the largest districts in the country with influence over how children come to school every day and how educators receive them, how do you think about universe of obligation? What do we owe each other as citizens, as neighbors, beyond, let's say, our family that we might take for granted? You would always help your mother up if she fell. What if you encounter someone you haven't met, or a friend that you haven't met yet, as a teacher might say, on the first day of class? How do you want children to be received? How do you want educators to think about those kinds of obligations that we have to each other, and schools as that kind of microcosm of community?
See, I think we have an opportunity, and that's part of the core of what public education ought to be like in this country. Spoke to it a little bit earlier. Public education is a linchpin in our democracy. So an informed citizenry, number one, is going to be critical so that they are not misled, brainwashed, taken advantage of by what they see and hear, but they become critical thinkers and responsible citizens. And part of the responsibility of citizenship is this notion of empathy and caring for others. And so I think in our school setting, we have an obligation and a wonderful opportunity to teach children to care about others. And that sense of empathy, of understanding, of inclusion is absolutely a part of the DEI work that's expected in public education. And I think it's critical for our country. If we can at least give them a good dose of what it means to understand the shoes that someone else walks in and to have some empathy toward those individuals, we can give children a good foundation in that. I think we help produce a citizenry that will be caring, that understands their neighbor is beyond the person right next door. If someone falls, if someone's hurting, the notion of charitable giving to help those who are in need. Our schools wrap their arms around disaster relief and let's raise money, let's send shoes, let's send clothing to Haiti where there's been a terrible disaster, or to the Panhandle where there's been a hurricane. That kind of teaching and encouraging can be the hub of our school setting as well. And it's teaching our children to care. I don't know any plainer way to put it than to care about humanity at large. Save our earth, help those who are hungry. Let's help those who have medical issues and those who can't afford enough food to eat. Those kind of issues are central in what we are doing in schools that help our children grow up to be responsible citizens.
So I'd love to just talk for a minute about the role that instructional materials play in that, because as you mentioned, learning about others and learning about their experiences. There are those who are close enough to us that if we live in Florida, we may know people who are personally affected by recent hurricanes. And that may be upfront and in our consciousness. How would you like educators to think about resources like the internet and the proper way to invite that into your classroom? What doesn't make it into your classroom? How would you know the difference? With that objective in mind, of learning about others, learning about things that you don't know about.
So the internet can be both a blessing and a curse. The vast knowledge at the fingertips of our young people is just mind-boggling, for lack of a better term, because what we used to have to look at an encyclopedia to find, and go to the library and use the card catalog, talk to people nowadays, our young people would say, what's a card catalog? And pretty soon they may say, what's a library? Because there are no encyclopedias that they need to go to look up information. So the on-time information that children are exposed to is incredible. That much information being at their fingertips is impressive. And it's certainly something that didn't exist when I was growing up. So I think that's the blessing. Our young people have a vast array of knowledge that is at their fingertips and available to them. Here's a curse. Among that vast accumulation of information is a lot of falsehood. And what we have to be careful about is that our young people know how to be critical thinkers and problem solvers who gather information, but who also know how to curate information that they might see on the internet. That is so critical. Dan, otherwise, why do we have to have an argument now again around whether or not the earth is flat? If it starts on the internet, people think it must be true. And so we've got to have our young people both take advantage of this wonderful opportunity called the internet, but also be very careful consumers who will be critical thinkers, who will curate that vast information that is available to them so that they put aside things that just aren't true. And I think that has to be something that both parents and schools will need to guard against. If it's on the internet, it doesn't mean that it's true. We've got to help our young people around that. I wouldn't go back to the encyclopedia. I want them to have this. There is no going back. You're not going to close Pandora's box at this point. But I want them to have that access but I need them to be critical thinkers who will not easily be misled by someone who puts a hoax on the internet or intentional misleading information. We've got to teach our young people to be critical thinkers and to really disaggregate what they might find on the internet.
Yeah, yeah, and you're speaking to that there is no going back. This is the world that we live in, and that we can't block this out, right? So that it's, I think, a sort of an impossible task to expect anyone to sort of filter all information such that only one type, whatever you might say, one type of information reaches students. The fact is that it's all in some form or another, it's going to reach them, and the question will be, how will they respond? What sense will they make of it? What tools do they have to interpret the signal from the noise, the truth from the fiction?
Absolutely. And let me mention, when it comes to the school setting, every teacher is not just left to their own devices to try to figure out the curriculum. That is not the case. In every school district, there's usually a central office that curates some of the curriculum information. They've got to meet the state standards, and then they have to go through some kind of curation to make sure they're not just using information haphazardly off of the internet. Can a teacher do that on their own if they desire? Probably, but that's not going to get them the best evaluation when it comes to how they're instructing their children. And I will tell you, I believe our teachers want to teach accurate and important information and stick to the standards that are approved by the state, because that's how they're judged. At the end of the day, students are tested on those standards.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is something that the closer you get to schools, the more you understand and the more you sort of see how the process works. The farther you are, the more contrived your notions can become, and the more susceptible you are to misinformation about schools themselves, let alone misinformation about what reaches students and how instruction.
And you know what? I love that point. And here's how we know that we've sort of had this glitch, because I think we have a generation that's gotten through K-12 that now depend on the internet for their information and sometimes seem to be misled. And so I wonder, it's always easy to see very clearly looking in the rearview mirror. I wonder if when the internet became all the craze and that first generation of students that were graduating, if we gave them enough tools to say, everything on the internet is not true. Let's at least be reasonable here. Because I've had adults actually share with me information that they found on the internet. Surely it's true because it's on the internet, and it's just ludicrous that people can be so easily misled. We've got to have some mechanism for teaching the citizenry at large. Here's how you differentiate. Can't depend on Facebook and others to make sure everything that's provided to you is accurate. Here's how you make sure you are curating your own information and watching your diet on what you read on the internet.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well said. So as we're starting to close out, welcome any other comments or questions from our audience. I'd love to put to you, as you look ahead, one thing that gives you hope and one thing that concerns you. That you see work still to be done. It's you sort of sitting where you are. You have a vantage point over the landscape of education in Florida, obviously in Orange County, across the country. What's one thing that? Why don't we start with maybe the cloudier picture and then the sunnier one to follow? What's something that concerns you these days?
So. Yeah, a couple of things come to mind, Dan. I am concerned at any efforts that seem harmful to my students and their particular needs. I am deeply concerned at some efforts that seem intentionally harmful for LGBTQ students and questioning students as well. I am deeply concerned that adult efforts around that may be politically motivated can be harmful to young people. I think we have to be extremely careful. When I know suicide rate among that particular population are higher than any other population, I want to guard them against this adult bickering around certain issues that will impact them. But that is concerning to me. Secondly, I'm certainly concerned over achievement gaps that just we have not overcome in the years past But while we may have been gaining on them, then pandemic comes along and it exacerbates those gaps through the digital divide as well. So I'm concerned that that we have to do enough to really narrow and close some of those opportunity gaps for our young people. We cannot discount what poverty does in certain households, cannot discount that Johnny's family doesn't have high-speed internet at home. Even if I give him a laptop, he's got to have some additional assistance if he's going to have the same opportunity as Roberto, who's going home with high-speed internet, as well as other resources in the home. We have to continue to make efforts toward equity for those children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds.
I want to, I know I asked you, I want to hear the sunnier side as well, but I want to just remark on something that you were talking about there in terms of student identity, something that we think about a lot when we're curating the materials that we're searching for that we think may be helpful for schools, is that there are issues around which we believe that it is helpful to frame a pro-con or a this or that kind of a point of view so that students can judge this. But identity is not one. There are not two sides. There's not a pro-con to a person, a child's identity. Every child belongs, and that is an absolute truth from which we proceed. And I think we're in an environment that's deeply disturbing to us where it does feel like it's zero sum. It does feel like if we're going to say that someone belongs, then someone else it somehow can't belong as well. And that part of this may also come, we talked about fear earlier, I'm afraid that I won't belong, and that it comes down to an innate human a need for belonging. And whenever that is under threat, we see that sort of fear mongering, we see that exclusionary behavior, we see that sort of need to draw a line and say us and them, because we become territorial, we become defensive, we sort of retreat. That kind of lizard brain is activated. And it becomes this primal fear, and that once activated can motivate people to behave in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. And it's almost a daily battle that we have to fight to overcome that, because we will retreat into ourselves and away from others and away from the communities progressively into smaller and smaller, inner sanctums where the only people we'll talk to are, the 5 or 6 people we live with. And that's not a democracy, and that's not a society for all. So,
and if you trace over the years, Dan, that's what's happened over the generations. When some different group appeared on our shores, there was discrimination and there was mistreatment, mostly based on fear and misinformation.
And we're a nation of immigrants, and generations of immigrants have wanted to belong, and when they felt a sense of belonging, they've turned that back against others. And
the next group.
The next group, because if you don't belong, then I do, and if I do, then you don't. So in the minute that we have left, I want to give you a moment what are some sunny spots, something that inspires you?
I think I am most encouraged. I told you this before. When you deal with our young people, they will lighten your heart. They will bring a smile to your face because you realize someday they're going to be in charge and they get it. I am most thrilled when I talk with my student advisory council, those high school students who are looking to make a difference in the world as they get ready to launch off into college and career. It is invigorating to me that our young people have not been somehow tainted or damaged by some of the dialogue that's going on among the adults in the last few years. I see such hope and such encouragement. And I have to say, it doesn't matter sometimes what their parents' preferences might be. Quite often, they diverge from that because they are independent thinkers. So we can teach them to be critical thinkers, to be problem solvers, and to care about individuals as individuals, and agreeing that everyone should be respected and included. I think we still have a bright future. I think our nation has a bump to get over that hopefully will be turning soon. It's unfortunate that we went down that path because I thought we were so much further down the road around this notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we will see a recovery, and I'm encouraged because of our young people. And again, I encourage parents to take part in their schools if they have concerns, volunteer and get engaged. And I absolutely believe parents can choose what they want their children to be exposed to in the media center, for example, without insisting that nobody else's child can read a story, a book about children having two mommies, because that's reality for some of our babies, and they need to be able to read that book. So as long as you don't try to ban it for everybody, I agree that parents have have that right and that authority over their own children. Our future is bright, though, because of our young people and incredible adults that work with them, teachers, counselors, principals, and central office. They do phenomenal work on behalf of our young people. And I think we have K-12 education still has a bright future.
Well, Dr. Jenkins, I very much appreciate those words. And I would venture to say that I won't name the number of decades, but some number of decades ago, people were saying the same about us when we were the children and we are now the adults, that we had a bright future and we brought that forward, and a little bit at a time we improve. And the closer we get to schools, the better we understand them, the better we can support them and respect the work that they do. So thank you so much for taking time and sharing your thoughts and experience with us today. And I think we're gonna end on that note, though I'm not exactly sure how we're going out. So I might leave that.
It's been a pleasure, Dan. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much.